I'm fascinated by the story of Dorothy Day, not because she was an exceptionally good person, which I do believe she was, but because she was a complicated person who really struggled with how she could develop a life of integrity, a life that she could live with. In a way, you could say she worked really hard to make sure that her inside life matched her outside life. Dorothy Day was born in 1897 in Brooklyn, New York, and she was raised in a fairly typical middle class family with her siblings. The family relocated to California when her father was employed as a sports writer. And not long after that, the 1906 earthquake happened, and it changed their lives and made a deep impression on young Dorothy, as you can imagine. The newspaper plant where her father worked was absolutely destroyed, and they, like many others, were suddenly without income, or in some cases, without even a home to live in. Dorothy remembers her parents helping the people in need in her community during those hard times. It was a moment that undeniably planted a seed in her heart that would sprout and flourish for years to come. When Dorothy finished school, she went to the University of Illinois with hopes to become a journalist. There she became friends with social activists and young and idealistic communists who opened her eyes to the plight of the poor on their doorstep and encouraged her to become engaged in political change. Dorothy herself was poor at that time, and she was awakened to a need that was all around her in a way that she hadn't before. She wondered why it was that so much time and so much money was spent on trying to remedy social evils instead of doing something to eliminate those evils in the first place. She wrote in her book, Long Loneliness, "Where were the saints to change the social order?" She likened it to good hearted people feeling the need to minister to slaves, but not doing anything to actually end slavery itself. And she was deeply offended that it was not her fellow Christians, but the much maligned communists who were actively trying to help the poor by advocating for real change. Her disappointment in the faith of her childhood led her to dismiss the church and align with the socialist underdogs. As a journalist with the New York Call, her colleagues were communists and labor organizers and various free thinkers, often labeled as anarchists, many of whom were opposed to the state's involvement in the First World War. She covered labor meetings and university sit-ins opposing conscription. She reported on bread riots against the high cost of living, strikes, unemployment, and many other forms of human misery. She became involved in a suffragette march demanding the right to vote for women. And she ended up in jail along with many of those protesters that day. While prisoners, they staged a hunger strike, which, while somewhat effective, did not in the end move the cause forward as much as they had hoped. It was then, in jail, that Dorothy lost faith in just about everything. She spent the next few years indulging every single one of her senses, doing whatever pleased her, but she still felt empty inside. She met a man whose political opinions matched hers, and they decided to make a life together. They were well off, living by the sea, far from the poverty and problems of the city. But despite the peaceful place that she was in, something would not quiet in Dorothy. She found that she had started to pray when she was getting the mail, when she was cleaning the house, all hours when she was awake, and even when she was asleep, it seemed. Then Dorothy learned that she was pregnant. And in her heart, she knew that when her baby was born, she wanted him or her to be baptized. At first, it was just the hope that belonging to a faith would give her child the order missing in her own life. Then she began to pray for the gift of faith for herself. She writes, "I was sure but not sure. I postponed that day of decision. Is that a familiar story for you? Wanting for your child or seeing in your child a faith that you don't dare quite claim for yourself? Such wonder and tenderness so very often opens us up or opens the door to God's own Spirit to continue its work in us. For Dorothy, the spiritual development that was going on inside of her was further complicated because her partner thought that all religion was weakness, and she knew that he would leave her if she admitted that she longed for faith to be a part of her life. The knowledge that she would almost certainly lose her mate if she became a Christian made her pause in her decision to say yes to Jesus. But ultimately, nothing less would satisfy. So great was the working of the Holy Spirit in her heart. Dorothy and her daughter were suddenly on their own, but quite amazingly, they then were able to step right into the family of God. Dorothy determined that it was not helpful to just be critical of the church's lack of engagement in making life more just for the poor. She reasoned that if communism was radical in their concern for the poor, then why wasn't Christianity radical too? Surely Jesus' gospel was as radical as it gets. She determined that she would gather others to help her begin changing things from the inside out. Now, soup kitchens were not uncommon in the 20s, but Dorothy's investigation had her looking into the causes of poverty, the things that brought those people to the soup kitchen. And she found that they almost always started with unjust labor practices. Bosses employed policies and practices that were deeply invested in keeping the poor poor. She campaigned for miners, for agricultural workers, and protested against practices of child labor and exploitation. To get the word out more effectively, she and friends began to publish the Catholic Worker newspaper that was distributed on the streets for sale for just 1 penny per copy. That price remains in effect today. Of course, Dorothy made enemies along the way, especially among those in power. She annoyed people because she challenged them. But her biggest challenge came when she really started to take the Beatitudes to heart, especially the verse that says, "Blessed are the peacemakers." Pacifism, resistance against violence of any kind, and against war of every type, became the center point of her mission and her writing. And in the years of patriotic fervor leading up to the U.S.'s involvement in the Second World War, and after that, the war in Vietnam, words advocating for peace, well, they became fighting words. Day was branded un-American. She was suspected of being a commie, a Soviet mole, a threat to her country. She was arrested, maligned, and threatened. Her support even in the church dwindled, but she continued to push forward in the decades of protest and progress that followed. We heard Dorothy say on the video that many read the Beatitudes for enjoyment, but when it actually comes to practicing that part of the gospel, it becomes an act of conscience to see how far we go. Dorothy came to believe in the foolish, crazy love that God has for all people, for the wealthy and for the poor. God, she was convinced, did not despise the poor and vulnerable, as did so much of society around her. God actually demonstrated what we could call a preferential option for the poor. That God does not love poverty, but God cares deeply for those who suffer and insists that faithful living requires that we try to alleviate that suffering whenever and however we can. God does not hate the poor. God hates the systems that keeps the poor poor. Dorothy Day invites all of us to exercise a sense of personal responsibility in this. If you or I see something that needs to be done, well, we ought to find a way to do it. We won't settle for tisk-tisking over a problem. We'll try to find out what the root cause is, and then we'll work to correct that issue. People living on the streets or chronic food insecurity are issues that are common in our area. We have to wonder, what does that problem actually tell us about access to housing, to a living wage, or access to higher education and decent health care? Dorothy Day would have loved the tiny house initiative that communities like Calgary, Alberta, and Duncan, BC have adopted to change and stem the pandemic of poverty in their area. It's based on the conviction that having a home is the first step on the road to stability for every person. You don't use housing as a reward for good behavior. Shelter is a fundamental right, and it's foundational for stability. If you have an address, you can receive benefits. If you have a home, you begin to feel safe and hopeful for the future. And that in turn opens the door to making positive changes in one's life, including sobriety and the possibility of meaningful employment. The philosophy behind such a movement is perfectly aligned with Dorothy Day's determination to transform the soul-crushing experience of soup kitchens into warm places of hospitality where not only one's body, but one's soul could be fed. Our text from James reminds us that good intentions are not enough. We can say we love God, but unless we show that love to our neighbors through acts of kindness and service, it's pretty empty. So what are you going to do? The prophet Micah says that all of the sacrifices that we might bring to God, or all the offerings that we might put in our envelopes, well, that doesn't impress God so much as a heart that insists on justice, a life that practices kindness, and a soul that longs to love like Jesus. I'm interested in knowing where you think you can begin to make a difference, or how you've already started. Because you don't need to be a saint to make a difference. I love that Dorothy Day often said, "Don't call me a saint. I don't want to be written off that easily." She would want you to know that sainthood is hard work, despite the common perception that a person is simply born good and finds it easy and natural to follow Jesus, and that's what makes them a saint. The decision to be an ally for the poor in practical and tangible ways often takes guts, and it really takes courage. Very often, those we might consider saints have mostly walked alone. It's not easy. It frequently may have you getting pushback from rubbing somebody's fur the wrong way, whom you challenge them on what they might consider to be the status quo. It will cost you, maybe in love, maybe in friendship, almost certainly in your physical comfort. But it will change your life for the better, and it will make the world a better place. There's a poem I read often at funerals when we celebrate ways, sometimes big ways, sometimes little ways, people have made a difference in the world. And I'd like to close by reading it. It's called To Have Succeeded. To laugh often and much, to win the respect of the intelligent people and the affection of children, to appreciate beauty, to find the best in others, to leave the world a bit better, whether by a healthy child, a garden patch, or a redeemed social condition. To know that one life has breathed easier because you lived here. Well, this is to have succeeded. So I ask you, what does the Lord require of you? What will you do to leave the world a little bit better? Seek justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with your God, and you'll be on the right path. Amen.